Hello friends. Welcome to Car and Life channel. Which should I buy, FWD, RWD or AWD? Vehicle dynamics and stability control tested. If you're buying a new car, you'll face a choice of drivetrain layouts. And while engine position may vary from a front, rear or mid placement, the powered wheels will inevitably be those up front, those out back, or all four. Car advice reader Julie contacted us to ask which way should she lean for her next new car purchase. I'm keen to upgrade to a new car but I'm not sure what I should get, a front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive model. What's the difference between them, and which one should I buy? Great question, Julie. To answer it, we headed out to the Wide Open Driver Education Centre of Australia, DECA, Skidpan in Shepparton, Victoria, to put all three layouts to the test. We also called in Australian World Rally Championship, WRC, driver Chris Atkinson for a little help. Providing a good spread of purchase price, power output, and outright vehicle size, our three test cars for the day were the $29,990 Hyundai Veloster SR Turbo, $54,490 Holden Commodore SSV Redline, and $38,990 Subaru WRX. One of the country's top-selling sports cars under $80,000, the front-wheel drive Hyundai Veloster SR Turbo is powered by a turbocharged 1.6-liter four-cylinder petrol engine with 150 kilowatts of power at 6,000 rpm and 265 Nm of torque between 1750-4500 rpm. The Holden Commodore has long been Australia's favourite homegrown rear-wheel drive hero, and here in VF Series 2 SSV Redline guys, it comes with a 6.2-liter LS3 V8 delivering 304 kilowatts of power at 6,000 rpm and 570 Nm of torque at 4400 rpm. Lastly, the Subaru WRX. Arguably the world's most iconic all-wheel drive car of all time, this latest incarnation employs an all-new turbocharged 2.0-liter four-cylinder boxer engine, outputting 197 kilowatts of power at 5,600 rpm and 350 Nm of torque between 2400-5200 rpm. For consistency, all cars are equipped with their respective model's standard 6-speed manual transmission. With Chris Atkinson behind the wheel, each car tackles two tests: a dry, 90-degree corner and a wet, high-speed emergency lane change. The tests are carried out twice, once with all the standard stability and traction control systems on and once with all the systems off. Starting with our front-wheel drive car, Chris jumps into the Hyundai Veloster for its first stability on run through the dry, 90-degree corner, a test designed to simulate the sort of common country or suburban bend you're likely to come across every day. With stability on, Chris gets the Veloster up to 60 km per hour, lifts off the throttle just before turning into the left-hander and then jumps heavily back onto the throttle from the middle of the corner until the completion of the test. The result? Aside from a small amount of initial turn-in understeer, as Chris says, there's no real reaction. Because we're already sliding, the car knew what we were doing and it killed the power to the front wheels and we were in control. Chris turns off the stability control and we line up for the Hyundai's second run through the dry, 90-degree corner. Arriving at the corner at the same 60 km per hour target speed, Chris turns in and, almost immediately, the 1,330 kg Veloster understeers its way toward not only our outside corner cones representative of a public road center line but members of the Car Advice video team. Oh, a lot of understeer, Chris says. So a huge difference there. Just stayed on the road, but you imagine if there's a tightening corner or something like that and we'd have been in the trees. On that positive note, we change cars to the rear-wheel drive Holden Commodore. With more than double the power and torque of the Veloster SR Turbo, and an easy 400 kilograms of extra weight on board, Chris is interested to see how the big lump of local lion will go. With stability control on, Chris gives the SSV redline enough beans to have it not only sound good but also easily reach our 60 km per hour target approach speed. He lifts off, turns in and flattens the throttle and, nothing much happens. I tried to give it everything she's got but the traction control worked pretty well there, Chris says. It slipped a little bit initially, and then the rear just stepped out, but it caught it after that, and you really had no real drama to get around the corner. Moving on to the Commodore's second run through the dry, 90-degree corner, Chris disengages all the stability systems and plants the foot, noting some initial wheel spin off the line. Approaching the corner again at 60 km per hour, Chris lifts off, turns in and jumps back on the throttle. Immediately, the back end starts to swing around, necessitating some quickly inputted opposite lock to avoid taking out cones and or camera equipment. That was a little bit more exciting, Chris says. So you can see that traction control makes a huge difference in this car, especially when you put that power to the rear wheels. She just wants to step into oversteer straight away. Getting back to his World Rally Championship roots with the Subaru World Rally team, Chris jumps out of the Commodore and into the middleweight WRX. Hitting the dry, 90-degree corner at 60 km per hour, Chris turns in hard and flattens the throttle. Even more so than in the Commodore, though, it's a case of nothing much happens. A bit of understeer, but pretty stable, tending more towards understeer than oversteer, I'd have to say. With stability control off, Chris again lines up for the car's second run at the dry, 90-degree corner. Getting off the line briskly and cleanly, the all-wheel drive Subaru gets up to speed without drama before Chris lifts, turns, and plants the throttle. The outcome? Understeer, and plenty of it. A fair bit of understeer actually, Chris says, surprised. I expected a little bit of oversteer, but I would have headed off straight towards the camera and cleaned up the boys if I didn't jump on the brakes. With all three cars completing their 2 runs of Test 1, we move on to our wet, high-speed emergency lane change exercise designed to simulate a highway situation where a driver is required to change lanes as quickly possible, in order to avoid a hazard ahead. Starting again with the Hyundai Veloster, Chris increases the approach speed by 20 km per hour, to 80 km per hour. This time, instead of lifting off the throttle before turning in, Chris holds the throttle steady, doing his best to maintain our 80 km per hour target speed. He leaves the emergency swerve until the very last second, only applying the brakes once through the exercise. Rolling in at speed with stability on, Chris aggressively swerves right, then immediately left. Totally unfazed, the front-drive Veloster SR Turbo easily negotiates the course. And I didn't even touch the brakes then, Chris says. That's pretty impressive. We left that to the last second to swerve and miss the cones, straighten it back up, and the car did the rest of the work for me. I just did the steering and it sorted it out for me. Chris disables stability control and we start our approach for run 2. Coming in again at 80 km per hour, Chris once again swerves right, then left, but this time, the Veloster's rear end immediately starts to swing around before Chris lifts off the throttle. This causes the car's momentum to snap around in the opposite direction, often referred to as a tank slapper. So that was a bit more exciting, Chris says. I let it go a bit more than I probably should have, but it showed what can happen and you could easily go into a flat spin in that situation. With our lightest car on test already demonstrating just how big of an impact weight and momentum can have on an emergency situation, we jump into our heaviest car for the day, the rear-drive Holden Commodore. This will be interesting for sure, Chris says. I'm a little bit nervous. Opening up the SSV Redline standard bimodal exhaust, Chris quickly gets the big Commodore up to 80 km per hour before snapping it right, then quickly left. Impressively, with stability control on, the hefty Holden simply shakes off the wet, high-speed emergency lane change without fuss. That's not bad, Chris says with a smile. I threw it in pretty hard, turning right there. And, as I came back across and straightened it up, the car did the rest of the work for me. I barely touched the brake and it straightened up and I was able to slow down pretty easily. With stability control disabled, Chris takes off for run 2 in the V8 Commodore. Approaching at 80 km per hour, Chris notes a bit of rear end squirm putting the power down, then hooks hard into the test's right-left flick. Unsurprisingly, as soon as he turns the wheel left, the Holden's back end starts to step out, necessitating some opposite lock steering correction. That said, the experience is far less eventful than expected. That rear does want to go, but, to be fair, it wasn't as bad to control as I expected, Chris says. There's a lot of weight there and, if you do get that momentum shift, then it's going to slide. But the difference when you have traction and stability control on, compared to off, is massive in those conditions. Switching back into the all-wheel drive Subaru, Chris lines up for the car's first run through the wet, high-speed emergency lane change. With stability on, Chris approaches at 80 km per hour, and slams the 1,469 kg WRX right, then immediately left. What happens next is exactly what you want to happen if you ever find yourself in an emergency on-road situation: nothing. No slipping, no sliding, the wreck simply canters through the course, changing lanes on the super slippery surface without drama. Wow, Chris says. That's pretty good. They've all been impressive, but there was no overreaction at all. I'm pretty impressed with that. Keen to see how big of a contrast having stability off will provide, Chris disables the safety systems and we line up again for run 2 in the WRX. Up to speed quickly, Chris hits the first right-hand swerve at 80 km per hour, followed by the immediate left-hander. Blowing away everyone on the scene, the Subaru all but replicates its first run apart from the minutest shift from the all-wheel drive car's rear end, and despite having its stability control systems disengaged. That's not bad, is it? Chris says, smiling. Little bit of a fraction of oversteer, but, at 80 km per hour on a wet, slippery road and changing direction, and I barely had to do any correction at all. With each car completing their 2 runs of our 2 tests, it's time to recap the day's results with Chris. It's funny how it's such a big difference in some cars and in other cars, not as big a difference, Chris tells us. In the Veloster, you've got a big difference between having stability control on and off. And it really works well in the Veloster. Hop into the Holden, and even with stability control on, you can slide the car around, it moves around a fair bit. You turn stability control off, and it really wants to slide around and move a lot. And the Subaru, especially in the wet, high-speed lane change, there's barely any difference between having stability on, and I guess that's the all-wheel drive system working well. I was a little bit shocked when we were driving in the 90-degree corner and the car had a lot of understeer. I haven't experienced so much of that before in the Subaru, so I am a bit surprised by that. But, when you had stability control on, it actually worked a bit like a race car in terms of controlling the speed, and not just killing the power like it does, say, in the Holden. With the advantage of having a safe, controlled environment and a professional racing driver on hand to soundly put all 3 cars and drivetrain layouts through their paces, the whole day was a real eye-opener. Seeing firsthand the difference between having stability control systems on and having them turned off almost regardless of how many, or which, wheels power is sent to modern traction and stability control systems are not only comprehensive but comprehensively impressive. Whether it was the dry, 90-degree corner or the wet, high-speed emergency lane change, overall, the results were pretty clear. So, Julie, in answer to your question, while different drivetrain layouts absolutely have an impact on a specific vehicle's dynamics, they only really come into play in extreme situations or in situations where the safety and stability control systems have been disabled. What our day on the skidpan showed was that, regardless of whether you buy a front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, or all-wheel drive car, for the majority of day-to-day situations in a new car with the systems left on, there's not really a huge variance between the 3. Our video to this is the end. Thank you for watching. If you find our video interesting and useful, please like and subscribe our channel. Thank you.